Well, welcome back.
Welcome, folks.
We know it's been a minute. We had some issues getting this thing up.
We've been living up to our name. It really has been all that work for nothing.
So this is our,
Fourth time.
Fourth time
Attempt.
trying to record this.
I am not going to jinx it like I did last time. We are going to just move right on in. But I will say that my DMs were flooded with, where is 1948 Part 2? Where is 1948 Part 2? What the hell? Where is it? And here it is. The masses were calling and we're answering.
Ask and you shall receive.
Ask and you shall receive, even though that never really happened. But one day it will. I'm manifesting it now.
Well, this one isn't going to kind of be the same as last one. We're not going to have as many fun, silly topics about like people's facial hair or funny slogans or things like that.
Or dead eyes.
Or dead-eyed cat-looking people.
Yeah.
Not like that. This one is going to be about the more intense side of 1948. It is going to be about Harry Truman, Strom Thurmond, and the civil rights aspect of 1948. So we're going to be talking about civil rights today, and we have to address the obvious, which is that we are two white people talking about civil rights in America.
Yep.
So we need to talk about like what our responsibilities are on this topic. We need to, one, bolster Black voices, which we're going to do with some links down below this video. We need to talk about uncomfortable and untold topics.
Mm-hmm.
We have a quote at the end that really is going to kind of encapsulate what we're going for here.
Right.
And we need to call out white supremacy whenever
Mm-hmm.
we see it. And we need to put it in its context and make sure that it doesn't become malignant, because you got to treat white supremacy like a cancer and just keep hitting it with as much chemo and radiation until it dies. So we, in our
And
small
a good
part...
diet.
Sorry?
A good diet.
Oh.
A healthy workout regimen. Starve that cancer out.
Whatever you have to do. And in our small way, we are going to try to do that with this podcast. So we are going to start with where the Democratic Party was in 1948, especially with this coalition that it's formed. Talked about Thomas Dewey, and we talked about the state of the Republican Party in 1948. The Democrats are obviously in a completely different position. They are riding high after 12 years of controlling the White House, both houses of Congress. They've actually even turned around. They're getting some Supreme Court decisions that they like. Everything is just moving in the right direction.
Everything is looking up Milhouse.
Everything is looking up Milhouse.
Is that what it is?
Or no, sorry.
Coming up Milhouse.
Everything's coming up Milhouse.
Everything is coming up Milhouse.
You know why they picked Milhouse as his name?
No.
That was Nixon's middle name.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Richard Milhouse
Richard
Nixon.
Milhouse Nixon, yeah.
Richard Milhouse Pumpkin Papers Nixon.
All I remember about that... Oh, okay. One of the main things I remember about Milhouse, besides the fact that he was like a nerd, was like in the Simpsons hit and run game. Not to like take things
great
out of
game.
here, but
Always
the
reference
Simpsons
hit and run game
hit
whenever you
and run.
can.
If you kept hitting Milhouse, he'd be like, "I'm telling Weekend Dad." So I would do that just to hear that line and laugh.
I loved that game. I loved that game so much I can't even tell you. I mean, I loved The Simpsons. I have since I was like 7 years old. So.
I know you talk about The Simpsons a lot.
I do.
I'm sorry to derail. Let us get back to the much-awaited 1948 Part 2.
That is A-okay. So the reason why the Democrats were in this position of unparalleled power, really, was because they had formed a coalition of their usual members, which were the South, union workers in cities in the North. Like I heard one historian say that the Republicans were a national party before Roosevelt. The Democrats were a Southern party that had local offices all across major cities in the North. So like Cleveland, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, all those places kind of had like a Democratic stronghold. But then what happened is that a lot of black voters moved after World War I from the South to the North, and they started taking a lot of positions as union workers, and they switched from Republicans to Democrats. So now we had a voting block of our usual white Southern Democrats, our usual white, a lot of time working class immigrant union workers, and now black union workers. And this was creating a coalition that led to that like 528-8 blowout back in 1936. It led to years of Roosevelt. It led to control in both houses of Congress. But Roosevelt's dead now. And so we don't know if this coalition is going to stay with Truman, who, remember, is super, super unpopular at this point. Now, the way that Roosevelt was kind of able to balance this coalition by basically, like, how are black voters and white Southern voters in the same party in the 1930s and 40s? And what happened is that Roosevelt had a strong relationship with laborers. He made the Wagner Act. He made all these things that improved unions' representation in the country. But in the South, he treated the South, there's a great quote here, like a peculiar, unique hothouse flower that had to be handled carefully. So what this basically meant was local control. So all these New Deal programs had to get Southern support in the House of Representatives and in the Senate to get passed. So what happened, what the trade, I should say, that Roosevelt made was that he got their votes by making sure that all these New Deal programs that were going to improve the South, like the Tennessee Valley Association, CCC, all your alphabet soup stuff that you learned in school, that was all controlled by the white Southern Democrats, which meant the benefits of those programs exclusively were for white Southerners.
Surprise, surprise.
Right. So, like, and then also any sort of inkling of civil rights was instantly cut down in the House. So these white Southerners, even though they weren't a majority in the House or the Senate, were at the head of a lot of these committees. So a lot of civil rights legislation, including anti-lynching legislation, never made it out of committee. Also, the judiciary stayed far away from any sort of help with civil rights. So this includes a very famous case called the Scottsboro Boys, where these boys were falsely accused of rape, and it became a huge deal because they were obviously getting a terrible trial. Eventually, the Supreme Court had to step in, but the Justice Department under Roosevelt didn't do anything to help them. Now, there's no reason to think this is going to change under Truman. Roosevelt was a New Yorker. Roosevelt was from a more progressive side of the party. Truman was from Missouri. And Missouri, as he probably would have said it and does say it. Truman's grandfathers on both sides of his family were Confederate partisans, which basically is another way of saying Confederate guerrillas, and slaveholders. His mother thought John Wilkes Booth was a hero and refused to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom when he would visit. Refused to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom when she would visit her son in the White House. So
she's a gem.
Right?
A Southern gem.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, we should show some photos of her. And yes,
I will put some photos of her.
She looks just like, imagine, after the description, imagine her in your head. You're right. So there's no reason to think that Truman is going to move at all for civil rights. What happens is that in September of 1946, the civil rights leaders that include Walter White, who is the head of the NAACP, and yes, Walter White is a white man with a white mustache named Walter White, who was the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Yes.
He had been that for 10 years.
Makes sense.
It makes perfect sense.
Totally.
Walter White visits with Truman and is trying to encourage him to move more actively on civil rights. Now, Truman's advisors are all saying, like, hey, tell him that you're sympathetic, tell him that you understand the plight and understand the cause, but there's just nothing you can really do right now. So Truman tells him that,
True political leader.
Yes, exactly. He gives him the good old the political 1-2.
He gives him the political reach around.
Yes, he gives him a nice political reach around. And White could have just like kind of taken that and left, but what White does is that he tells Truman a story of a man named Isaac Woodard. Isaac Woodard was a sergeant who had just served 3.5 years in the Pacific, in the Philippines mostly. He was an artillery non-commissioned officer. The war ends in August 1945. It's February 1946. Woodard's on his way home. He's on a Greyhound bus with some other soldiers. He has his discharge papers. He had just been discharged hours before. He had like $600 in his pocket, which in 1946 money is like a fortune, especially if you're just like a guy from, where was he from? Winsboro, South Carolina, rural South Carolina. So he's going home to get his wife, and then they're going to move north to where his parents live. So he's on the bus, and he has to go to the bathroom. So he goes up to the bus driver and says, "Hey, can you pull over at the next stop? I need to use the bathroom." And the bus driver insults him. Basically tells him, "Sit down, boy," is what he tells him. And Woodard, a non-commissioned officer, a decorated soldier, says, "Don't talk to me like that. Talk to me like a man. I am a man just like you." That's all. What this does is this compels the bus driver to pull over at the next stop, find the nearest cop that he can, and the cops in a town called Batesburg, South Carolina, the cops, including the chief of police, Chief Shull, grab Woodard, take him off the bus, start talking to him. The bus pulls away, and then they start beating Woodard over the head. They take their blackjack batons, and they start viciously beating him over the head. Woodard grabs one of the batons, and the cops pull their guns on him and say, "Drop the baton or we'll drop you." Yeah, and then Woodard drops the baton, continues to get beat over the head until Shull takes the end of his baton and starts hitting Woodard in the eyes until he breaks the globe of his eyes, blinding him for the rest of his life. Woodard is sort of in and out of consciousness as he's dragged into the jail cell, thrown into the jail cell. They pour whiskey all over him and then write a report saying that he was drunk and disorderly. He's dragged before a judge the next day. They give him his charges. He's able to make it home where black newspapers catch the story, and they start spreading the story in the news. It gets eventually picked up by the national news because it is part of an entire year's worth of incidents like this. So about 1 million black soldiers fought in the war. 3/4 of them were from the South. Many of them were from the rural South. So when they get home, they had just fought a war against fascism and evil and hate, so they were expecting things to be different when they got home. They just fought for democracy. They expected to share in some of that democracy. But this was not the case. So Woodard wasn't the only one to experience this kind of horrific violence.
Also a side note, while they're in Europe fighting this war,
right, yes.
Europe doesn't have these tight segregation laws, so they're fighting amongst people of different skin colors, and they're being treated as if they're actual, human beings, because they are. So they get this taste of like what it is to feel like a part of the society and brotherhood. And then they get home and they're being berated and, they're trying to like take them down a peg because how dare you come for what has already been here.
Exactly. As a lot of these soldiers from the rural South did not know a world like that existed. So when they go to places like Paris, Belgium, the Netherlands, that just does not have the deep-rooted racism that we have here in America, good old US of A, they can't go back. They're not going to go back to... They can't unsee what they've seen. They can't unexperience what they've experienced. So they are going to fight for the rights that they've earned. Mm-hmm. There was a slogan that was used by a lot of black civil rights groups that was victory abroad and victory at home. Mm-hmm. So basically they were going to defend democracy abroad and they were going to defend democracy when they came back. Yeah. So this had been happening. This violence had been happening once black soldiers got home across the South. There was a man named Maceo Snipes who was shot in Tyler, Georgia on his front porch for voting in a Democratic primary. Days later, a mob, including law enforcement, kidnapped 4 black citizens, 2 men, one veteran named Roger Malcolm, and 2 women, one of whom was 7 months pregnant. They kidnapped them, dragged them out into the woods, and shot them 63 times. So there was other incidents. There was castrations. Another man was lit on fire with a blowtorch. Horrific violence occurred all throughout the South in the year of 1946. And what these white Southerners were so afraid of was that a lot of white supremacy is built on the basis of stripping, particularly black men, of their masculinity.
Yeah.
Which is why white Southern racists will call black men boy.
Yeah.
They are trying to infantilize them.
Mm-hmm.
They are trying to demean them. They are trying to make it clear that they are lesser.
Yeah. They're not a real man.
But a uniform is a great equalizer.
Yeah.
A uniform is literally a symbol of the United States government.
Yep.
And
especially a uniform that's decorated
right.
with war medals and purple hearts and all that.
And chevrons. Like,
yeah.
Remember, he was a sergeant.
Yep.
And non-commissioned officers going back to the Civil War, had a very unique spot in American history because a lot of times black men were not promoted to officers. So non-commissioned officers was almost seen as a very earned position that was given to black men that they shared a lot of pride in, rightfully so. So this was what basically caused a huge, violent backlash all throughout the year of 1946. So Woodard's story is interesting, though, because, one, he lived.
Yep.
He's alive to tell the story.
He's one of the very few that survived to tell his story.
We'll link his affidavit below of his account of what happened, but his story starts to catch national attention. Mm-hmm. There's a huge benefit concert. He's able to get $10,000, which is able to buy him a house. Orson Welles, who had a weekly radio broadcast at the time, promotes the story kind of like a mystery because, remember, he had just gotten off to use the bathroom. He had been blinded shortly afterwards, so he didn't know where he was. He didn't know who the cop that did this to him was.
Right.
So Welles hires an FBI. The NAACP gets involved. Their legal department was basically the only thing fighting for civil rights at this point, and they were fighting alone for decades. Thurgood Marshall was the head of the NAACP. The NAACP's office in New York, anytime an event like this would happen, would hang a flag saying a man was lynched yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Bringing attention to
right.
the
and
hatred.
And they had stacks and stacks of papers that they just didn't have the manpower for. So when they had this opportunity to raise attention, they took advantage of it. And they were able to get this audience with Truman. They tell Truman this story, and Truman is a veteran himself. Truman fought in World War I. He was an artillery officer. He was a returning veteran.
Truman was in the trenches.
Yeah. Truman was over there. And so this affects him very deeply. He had a lot of respect for men in uniform. So a man in uniform being horrifically beaten and blinded for life. So when Truman hears this story, he turns to his staff and he goes, "My God, I didn't know it was this bad. We've got to do something." And the next day, he talks to his DA and he mentions the Woodard story in the letter to his DA and says that we're going to start moving the Justice Department towards being more active on civil rights. And the next week, he directs the Justice Department to press charges against Shull. Now, the trial against Shull is a sham trial because even though it's the federal government, local federal offices are still done through Southern lawyers. they're still through Southern judges. So this was out of the federal courts in Charleston, South Carolina. And the Justice Department there doesn't call any witnesses. They don't get a medical examiner's report. Shull says that he only hit him once. And
Yikes.
the trial...
So it's not even a real trial.
No. And the jury comes back in 28 minutes. They would have come back in 8 minutes, but the judge goes for a walk. A guy named Warren Wades, who has his own unique story.
He's really cool.
He's a really cool guy. We're not going to get to him here.
Him and his wife.
Him and his wife are cool. There's a neat drug history on them, but I would do some more digging on them because they have a very unique story. So this is just a complete sham that goes nowhere. There is no justice for Isaac Woodard in this case, and this is a very common occurrence. One, like we mentioned, even at the federal level, there's still going to be Southern lawyers, Southern judges, and all white juries. The reason they were all white juries is because they were grabbed from voter registration lists, which were mostly all white. And also the FBI, which was run by great guy, friend of the podcast, J. Edgar Hoover, did not care to prosecute any of these cases. They were not helpful. They were more helpful in actually going after the NAACP. Mm-hmm. So it looks pretty bleak. But by the end of that year, Truman announces that he is forming a civil rights committee. And this civil rights committee meets for the first time in January of 1947. They meet in the cabinet room, and Truman attends the first meeting, and he tells them to take bold action. So he is really going headfirst into this. By all the writings, it seems like this did affect him on a personal level, that something lit a fire in him, and he was able to move forward on this.
Not just give the old political reach around.
Not give the old political reach around. Actually go all the way.
Mm-hmm. So, he really went home.
He went all the way home. Mm-hmm. And so this grows until in June 1947, he speaks before the NAACP at their annual meeting on the mall in front of the Lincoln Monument. And the NAACP at this time was still considered by a lot of people a radical organization. If you were a school teacher in 1947 and you were in the South and it was discovered you were a member of the NAACP, you were probably getting fired. So Truman giving this speech that was heard by millions of people, where he emphasized the national government's role in civil rights and their role of protecting civil rights for all Americans, was really groundbreaking because magnifying the role of the national government was unique, because the entire time before this, it was always a local issue, a state's issue. It was always something that the federal government was not a part of.
Right.
And he said that we can't wait for the slowest state or the most backward community. We have to take action right now. And just to give you an example, just to go back a little bit, the last time the president did sort of a progressive civil rights sort of action was Theodore Roosevelt in, I think it was 1904, invited Booker T. Washington, the famous black activist, black author, to the White House just to have a dinner with his wife and his daughter. And this was enough that the South lost their minds. There is
all a bunch of children.
Yeah, there's a South Carolina senator named Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who I swear to God is maybe, he has some stiff competition, but he might be the most evil person I've ever studied in history, at least American history. He is up there with possibly the worst person ever. He has a quote from this dinner that Roosevelt has that I cannot even list in the link below. Just Google it yourself, and it's horrifying. So that was the last time any president had really addressed civil rights. And keep in mind, that was when the workforce was desegregated. Shortly after that, in 1913, the workforce gets segregated. Neither party takes a strong stance on civil rights all the way up until Truman in 1946-47 starts to make these steps. So the Civil Rights Committee gives its report, and it's a really compelling report that details all the horrific racist stuff that's going on in America. So it's recommends ending disenfranchisement, like poll taxes, voter intimidation, all-white primaries. Just a quick side, if you don't know what poll taxes are, basically you used to have to pay a tax to vote. Like, you used to have to pay money. Now, you could get out of this poll tax in certain states through a grandfather clause, which meant if your grandfather could vote without paying the tax, then you didn't have to pay it, which obviously only applied to white people.
Right.
So it was
a systemic racist law that they had carried over from slaves.
Right, that was meant to keep black people from voting.
Yes.
Lynching in this report is described as a terrorist device, and the participants of which received almost complete immunity. They also recommended other sweeping reform like desegregating the military, desegregating the workforce, ending housing covens, which is basically you have to sign an agreement saying you won't sell your house to a black person. So Truman fully supports this. He gives his full support to the committee. And then, like we talked about, 1948 convention comes around. Hubert Humphrey gives that stirring speech. Because keep in mind, this is
Walk forthrightly
into the bright sun of civil rights.
Yeah.
Great speech. Amazing. This is not news even outside of politics. Because remember, Jackie Robinson integrates baseball in 1947. Churches were starting to kind of split apart based on where they stood on civil rights. It was all sort of coming to a head. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more about Truman's motivations per se, but a big motivation is definitely that all these horrible things that are happening are grabbed by the Soviet Union and used as propaganda against us. Like, they grab all these horrible stories and kind of are like, land of the free, huh? And this is also in decolonization.
Fair.
Yeah, no.
Fair point.
I mean, how are you going to argue that?
Right.
So this is also when decolonization is happening.
And then we're like, ew, they all get paid the same. Ugh, stinky.
Well, it's interesting. So the NAACP wants to go to the UN and file a human rights violation against America. And keep in mind, we're filing civil rights violations against the Soviet Union all the time for like people in Poland and East Germany having their freedom of speech, which is legitimately happening.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But
not saying that, the Russian communism was at all good.
But they had a point.
There were good aspects, right?
When it came to civil rights.
In no way do you look at American racism and think, yeah, there's some good guys. As someone who was recently president has said.
Right, there's
some fine people on both sides.
No, yeah. So
No, there's not.
So this is kind of becoming a driving force for effective change to happen. But basically, you cannot just keep treating the South as a peculiar, unique hothouse flower that has to be handled carefully. And that was from, I think, the current head of the Legal Defense Fund for the NAACP. Fantastic quote, because that is exactly what the what the Democratic mindset was towards the South. Now, as we were there last week, we are at the 1948 convention, and the South walks out. What was it, like most of Mississippi?
The South will rise again.
They tried.
Yeah.
So they walk out. They have what's called a rump. The Dixiecrat convention is held in Montgomery, Alabama. There's about 6,000 delegates. 13 southern states are represented. They got the Confederate flags going. They got the pictures of Robert E. Lee. It's weird. It's kind of a proto version of the George Wallace stuff we talked about in our 1968 election. So they all gather and they nominate Strom Thurmond to be their presidential nominee. And Strom Thurmond
is a colorful character.
We talked a little bit about him in 1968 because he kind of is a representative of the party switch. This is when he is firmly with the Democrats. Mm-hmm. And Strom Thurmond...
The Dixiecrats.
Pardon me. Well, now he is a Dixiecrat, even though he hated being called the Dixiecrats. And anybody who would bring that up, he would correct and be like, no, we're the states' rights party. Whatever.
Okay. Sure.
Talk about political reach-arounds there.
Yeah, really.
So Strom Thurmond is born in 1902 in Edgefield, South Carolina. And just to give you one piece of information about him that I think really should show you like
What kind of person he was.
where he came from. His dad was the lawyer for Pitchfork Ben Tillman.
Oh.
So he
must have been such a good person.
He comes from a certain class.
Yeah.
And there's one particular unique story that has kind of survived even more than Strom Thurmond and kind of has stuck with him for a while. So did you want to tell the folks about that story?
Yes. I would love to. Thurmond, when he was 23, he was a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young college graduate who was a teacher at this time. He was living at home with mom and dad, and mom and dad had a 15-year-old maid, black maid, named Carrie Butler. 15-year-old Carrie Butler is being swooned by 23-year-old Strom Thurmond.
Gross.
Gross. So one thing leads to another, and they have a daughter named Essie Mae Williams, and she's born October 12th, 1925. So to avoid a scandal, Carrie Butler, she sends her daughter to live with her sister and her husband, Mary Williams, in Pennsylvania, which is where she gets her last name, Williams. There in Pennsylvania, they raised her as their own. And then at 13 years old, Butler is in Pennsylvania she came to like visit and, be like the fun aunt. Except she bursts her bubble and she's like, I'm your mom. Basically just like blurts it out one day. She's just like, I'm your mom. Haha, isn't that funny?
So this incredible life-changing event. She just kind of was like, oh, by the way.
Yeah, she kind of just turns her on her head and like turns her entire world upside down. She has to deal with, realizing at 13 that her mom, who she thought was her mom, is not her mom. In fact, it's her aunt. So she comes to terms with that. And 3 years later, while they're visiting South Carolina for a family funeral, her mom walks into her room the next day and is like, put your best dress on. You're going to meet your father. And she's like, sweet, cool, awesome. Like, I guess she said like in her memoir, she was like, never really talked about him, never really like wondered who he was. I thought that he kind of just was like some guy.
Just wasn't discussed.
Yeah, it wasn't really discussed. And it was also like she figured it was a, young love kind of thing. And when he found out she was pregnant, it was like a scandal. And, he kind of like did his own thing and kind of left. Anyways, they put on their best dresses and they walk from the black side of town. And while they're walking, they start getting into the white side of town, which of course is pristine and well kept. And, who's keeping these pristine and well-kept? Black people. Hired black people. So anyways, she figured that, we're in the white side of town. My dad is probably a butler for one of these wealthy white dudes. They come up to a law firm building, and on the building it says Thurmond and Thurmond. And when the black servant opened the door, she thought that was her dad. But he quickly ushered them to an empty office and had them sit there. And then Thurmond, who is now a 38-year-old lawyer and judge, walked in and stared at her and just said, you have a lovely young daughter. Not saying I have a lovely young daughter or, wow, our daughter is so beautiful.
Your daughter.
Yeah, your daughter. And then Carrie kind of looks over and she's like, that's your dad. And, it's another, like, world-altering, just fucking...
She just kind of passes right over.
Ripping the fucking, the rug from under this poor girl's feet at 16 years old. And she's like, that's my dad? So, while he's talking to her, he's trying to do, like, this fatherly thing where he's like... Yeah, you should know what South Carolina is, and you're from here, and you should learn about South Carolina. You are a South Carolinian. He asks her if she knows what a palmetto is. It's a small palm tree. He points at the state emblem, which has a palmetto growing out of a fallen oak tree, and the words quis separabit, and I probably said that so wrong, but it's Latin. And he's like, do you know what that means? And she's like, no, why the fuck would I know Latin, bro? And then he like does the fatherly thing, and he like puts his hand on her shoulder, and he's like, who can separate us?
That's what it means.
Yeah. He, of all people, says that to her.
I never knew that's South Carolina's quote. South Carolina has who can separate us?
Yeah,
oh my God.
Yeah. And I mean, seriously, they were the first to secede in the fucking Civil War. And their fate saying is who can separate it? Oh, fuck off.
Yeah.
Fuck off, South Carolina.
So we were going to do part of this about how, I mean, the Pitchfork Ben Tillman thing should just kind of give you an idea of South Carolina's politics. But keep going.
Yeah, so he's still, he's trying to do the fatherly thing, and basically is like telling her, like, you stay away from them fried foods. And she said that he like looked her up and down and looked at her body and was like, yeah, don't gain any more weight. You should probably lose some weight. Don't eat any of that fried food, even though it's really good, but just don't eat that fried food. It'll kill you. And, he's like trying to be fatherly, but also like not taking any responsibility. He talks to them for about an hour, and she said it was more so just him talking to them and lecturing them as if they're stupid. And he's just like, yeah, like, this is local politics. You probably don't know anything about it. And I'm, blah, blah, blah. And then he ushers them away because he's busy. Mm-hmm. He's a big, strong lawyer man who probably has to go and fucking ruin someone's life. That looks just like his daughter. Again, before he ushers them out, he says, he looks at her again, and he looks at Carrie, and he says, you have a lovely daughter. Basically separating himself from her again. Mm-hmm. And she noted that right away. She was like, oh. She also noted that he did not invite her to come back to visit again, so she didn't think she would ever see this man again. 5 years later, in the 1948 election, Thurmond is running the state's right party ticket, and he's claiming there's not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our houses, and into our churches. This man who has a half-black daughter is saying this bullshit and pushing this fucking rhetoric. It's disgusting. So throughout his life, his long fucking life, and his long career until he fucking died, he literally died in office at the ripe age of 100. He met with her frequently for 50 years. And when he would meet with her, it would only be in his office. He would be lecturing her most of the time. And sometimes they would actually have debates. They would have debates about race and politics. And at the end of their meetings, he would hand her envelopes with $100 bills in them. And over the 50 years, he gave her over $100,000. And that can only be seen as hush money, basically, to be like this unspoken thing between us. Yes, he never admitted to her that he was the father.
Yeah.
That he was her father. Never said, I love you. He did not recognize her publicly. It was a very strained and very one-sided relationship. When he died at the fucking ripe age of 100 in 2003, she basically came out and she was like, yo, at this point, she's 78.
Yeah.
And she's a retired school teacher.
Yeah.
She took after her dad, actually. And she was like, yo, this was my dad. So she comes out and tells the whole world, like, this was my dad, this piece of shit over here. And then she further explains it in her memoir in 2005. And that's when, like, most of the world finds out, like, what this man had been up to.
I do remember it was shocking news. Like, it was legitimately shocking news.
And it's not even like, the good thing, too, is that the family didn't try to deny it. The family was like, yes, absolutely. She is part of she is, like, Strom Thurmond was her dad.
Yeah. His granddaughter, Essie Mae's daughter, and Strom Thurmond's grandson, I think, because Strom Thurmond's grandson eventually becomes it was either his son or his grandson, becomes a member of the South Carolina legislature. And they come together and they reconcile.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of brings up an interesting point. It's another story about Strom Thurmond is that in 1957, he gives the longest... Did we talk about that last time?
Oh, God. I read about it.
He gives the longest filibuster the 1957 Civil Rights Amendment, where to avoid using the bathroom, he dehydrated himself, and to eat something, he makes hamburger meat and pumpernickel bread, kind of little sandwiches, and he's on the floor for like 27 hours, and he is able to get one bathroom break in because... Barry Goldwater kind of gives him some help. But his next bathroom break, he goes to the coat room because he has to keep one foot on the Senate floor the entire time and pisses into a bucket. So while still spewing racist rhetoric, because he didn't filibuster in the way some folks do, where they will read the book. I think Ted Cruz read Green Eggs and Ham or something like that. He just straight up says racist stuff, reads from racist books, and promotes white supremacy for 27 hours.
Yeah, while he has a secret black daughter,
which is the thing
on the DL.
Because the reality of this is that for every pitchfork Ben Tillman, you get a lot of guys who are just kind of these opportunistic weasels. Mm-hmm. So when civil rights wasn't the kind of topic of the day in the 1930s and 1940s. The South was a one-party state, right? There was no Republicans. The Democrats won every single year. So the race was really won in the primary.
Right.
Now, if you're running against another Democrat and you're both kind of very similar on these issues, the margins are going to be razor thin. So what might make the difference is the few amount of black people that actually do vote. So what a lot of these Southern Democrats, who again are huge proponents of white supremacy, would do is that they would pay the poll taxes of certain black voters to win those margins. And they would get that in exchange for certain promises, very small, minuscule promises that would improve the lives of the black constituency just a little bit. Mm-hmm. But when civil rights is the big issue of the day, now suddenly they're all big-time segregationists. And then once the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act are passed, these guys still need a career, so they can't be like big-time, all over the place segregationists. So they'll do things like Strom Thurmond started a scholarship program. He actually, a guy who just ran against his eventual replacement, which was Lindsey Graham, was a black man whose mother worked for Strom Thurmond. So he shifted just enough not to be universally hated, but to keep his career.
He's a chameleon.
But remember, like we talked about last time with the 1968 election, you got that Lee Atwater quote. So he doesn't come out and just say segregation, segregation, segregation.
Right.
He has to do other things and kind of weasel his way in. So he does things like, he says states' rights still. He does low taxes. It's dog whistling. And immediately after 1948, because spoiler alert, he loses. He wasn't really trying to win anyway.
Right.
He was just trying to be a spoiler candidate because remember, they still had that big voting block in the House of Representatives. Oh, and if you're not from America, fun thing, we have the Electoral College. Amazing. I love it. Democracy.
We all love it. Literally every election, everyone gets together and they're like, we love the Electoral College. We can't wait to see what states goes to who. And this thing is definitely not outdated, nor is it systemically racist.
It's definitely not from the 18th century where they thought that bleeding in enemas was the way to cure the cold.
Absolutely.
No. So what this means is that when there's no majority in the amazing, incredible Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives. But it doesn't just go to a straight vote of the House of Representatives. That'd be stupid. Mm-hmm. So what it does is that all the states have little delegations that they all send, and those vote, which obviously gives the South, that doesn't have a lot of population, it has more like states than population. It gives them a huge advantage. So they were trying to make it so that no one won a majority of the electoral vote. They'd have to come to the South to make a deal. And the deal would, of course, involve cutting any civil rights legislation. That was their plan. It didn't work. Harry Truman wins because people kind of will point to this and they'll be like, well, if the South is so racist, why did they vote for Harry Truman? Why didn't they just all vote for Strom Thurmond if that's what they don't care about? And that's just not how politics works.
No.
A lot of people are blue no matter who. Also, lots of times you vote for a person that has a policy that you find completely heinous. You or I are in the same situation.
Yeah. I mean, it's the age-old problem with a two-party system where you have one person who sucks really hard, really bad, and then the other person sucks also, but just a little bit less.
Right. And so if you're a white Southerner, like you're not gonna waste your vote on a third party and let the Yankee from New York win.
Right.
You'll vote for Harry Truman. So that's what ends up happening. And then Thurmond, like you alluded to, has a long, beautiful career after this. He dies at 100 years old, still a senator, still passing legislation. A man born in 1902 voted on legislation that affected both of our lives.
Yeah, he voted on the Iraq War.
He voted on the Iraq War. And just to hit this fact, just to really emphasize how this was not that long ago.
Yeah.
This was not that long ago. I already mentioned that his replacement was Lindsey Graham, who is still a senator today. Yeah. The man who spoke at his funeral and gave his eulogy is the current president, Joseph Robinette Biden. They were close allies in the Senate for
they worked
decades.
Very closely together and were very good friends.
They were very good friends. They are seen being jovial with each other all the time.
Yeah, there's lots of pictures of them together.
And just like we mentioned before, Thurmond, the typical chameleon, eventually votes for the reauthorization of the Civil Rights Act because he was pushed by Joseph Biden to do that because he was given who the hell knows what. So Thurmond becomes a staple of conservative politics for the next few decades. He runs again in 1960 as Harry Byrd's vice president because, again, they were trying to do the same thing over again and be a spoiler because they didn't think Kennedy or Richard Nixon were enough white supremacists for them. Yeah, so we're not going to mention Strom Thurmond again. His relationship with Carrie Butler, they did seem to have more of an intimacy, right?
They did, yeah.
Yeah.
She was in love with him.
Yeah.
And he very much was not, but like he was and he wasn't. You know, he would never come out and say it. But they had like an unspoken thing. Ugh.
I mean, you kind of, not to psychoanalyze people, but we kind of might look at that as a trauma response today.
Yeah.
And also, Strom Thurmond, on top of just, so many other great things he did, was also a creep in the fact that he constantly married younger women.
Yeah.
Including when he was like in his 60s or 70s, marrying someone 30 or 40 years his junior.
It's fucking nasty. Yeah, I read that, I think this was 5 years. I think it was around the 1948 election. He married a beauty queen when he was almost 40 and she was like 21 or something like that.
Fucking gross.
Yeah.
Ew.
Yeah.
So this is
We see a common theme here.
We see a common theme here. And I'm going to put a quote from Mary Chestnut, who had a very famous diary during the Civil War. She was the wife of James Chestnut, who is also a South Carolina senator. And this kind of talks about how this relationship between Carrie Butler and Strom Thurmond is part of a very insidious pattern of white Southern Aristotelian society that goes back centuries. So that's all we're going to say about Strom Thurmond. Now we're just going to kind of wrap up Harry Truman.
More like weak Thurmond. Oh. Mic drop. Sorry.
We got to get a shirt that says that. Oh, speaking of which, so you know how we'll talk about this more later. We can cut this all out. But it's funny because we were making fun of Thomas Dewey's "The future is ahead of us." Well, the Truman's catchphrase was "Give 'em hell, Harry."
Give him hell, Harry.
So yeah, like kind of, which I think promotes my Kamala Harris comparison more. Like, which guy sounds like he's going to have the catchphrase "Give him hell, Harry," and which one right now sounds like the future is ahead of us? Yeah, which is why you need to study history, folks. Anyway, after Truman gives this speech back in 1948 during the convention, a friend, somebody he served with in France, writes to him trying to encourage him to drop civil rights or he'll lose the election. And Truman responds, and he mentions Isaac Woodard again. Mm-hmm. And he says that he wants to right these wrongs, and if he loses the election, at least it was for a good cause. And he actually keeps this letter sealed until his death.
Wow.
So he was not using it for political purposes.
Okay.
It seems to me like he had a legitimate change of heart.
Yeah.
But
like a come to Jesus moment.
A kind of a come to Jesus moment. But
he was still a politician.
He's still a politician.
Yeah.
Also, eventually he doesn't win. Like, this causes a lot of political capital for him. He doesn't run on civil rights, but he never backs down from his position of desegregating the military, desegregating the federal workforce, pushing for poll tax legislation, and Thurgood Marshall and Walter White campaigned for him. And eventually he wins states that he was supposed to lose, like California, Illinois, Ohio, and it turns out that the black turnouts there was really high. Mm-hmm. Oh, and one more thing about his whistle stop. His last stop was in New York, which was Dewey's home state.
Yeah.
And he goes and speaks in Harlem to a massive, enthusiastic crowd. And he is the first sitting president to speak in Harlem.
Wow.
So he maybe not be campaigning and bringing up civil rights everywhere he goes, but he does embrace it. It is something that he embraces and that black voting class embraces him. And we think of this now as kind of like, of course that's what happens. But after Roosevelt, people didn't know if black voters were going to stay with the Democratic Party or go back to the party of Lincoln. It was up in the air.
Yeah.
And Truman's actions solidify that. Truman's actions get followed by, in the 1960s, Kennedy and Johnson. And that's why since then, the black voting base in America has gone in the 80s and the 90s, usually to the Democratic Party, 80s and 90% to the Democratic Party. He also establishes the Fay Committee afterwards. The Fay Committee is going to be the ones that are in charge of enforcing the integration of the armed services.
Yes.
He appoints this guy Fay, who is from Georgia but was an activist for civil rights. He also appoints an editor of an African-American newspaper. The Air Force and the Navy, they capitulate pretty well. They start to integrate. The Army fights him the entire way. The Army argues that black soldiers are only good for menial labor and that the percentage of black soldiers should only be about 10%.
Yikes.
So eventually, Truman gets the Army to integrate. They're about 95% integrated by the time he leaves. It's debatable whether or not it was him or the Korean War, because remember, if you're fighting a war and you're caring about keeping your army segregated, there's very much a lack of efficiency.
Right.
So by the time Korea happens, we are an all-integrated military. And he also adopts these things called the amicus program. So an amicus curiae is a friend of the court. So what that means is that the federal government, when all these civil rights cases are coming up, they are offering their support for those arguing against segregation. And that includes a report that was from the Fay Committee on the morale of soldiers who are now in the integrated armed services. Mm-hmm. And this shows that the morale has been positively impacted by integration, and that integration is not something that should be held up as good law.
Right.
This is eventually given an amicus curiae brief to the NAACP, which they use in Brown versus Board of Education, which is what we talked about as kind of the big change that we all kind of think of.
Yeah.
But really what we want to talk about here, what I hope you get from this, is that there are stories like Isaac Woodard's all over. Oh, and Isaac Woodard, like I said, alluded to earlier, ends up having a pretty good life. He eventually gets his pension. He was initially denied his pension after being blinded.
I don't know why I am surprised when I hear things like this, because it's the fucking South and it's that time period, but like I'm always baffled by how disgusting people are.
Keep in mind, that was the federal government's choice.
My God.
The Army denied his disability benefits because he was discharged just a few hours earlier.
Jesus Christ.
Now, eventually this changes in 1961 to where it's not till a soldier is actually home that he is officially discharged. So Woodard is able to get a house from that benefit concert that was held earlier. He's able to get his disability benefits, and he runs a newspaper stand, which gets him a good amount of money. And then his disability benefits are able to get him enough disposable income that he buys an apartment and becomes a landlord, rents out this apartment to folks, and he's able to have a very he's able to have a more comfortable middle class life. And he's interviewed in the 1980s about how initially he held on to his bitterness for so long that he thought it would kill him. And so eventually he just learned to let it go, which I have no idea how. But I think he chose to have a good life, which really was probably the best revenge he could have gotten on the people that did that to him. So if parts of this story made you uncomfortable, if parts of this story made you feel a way that you don't like to feel, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
We're going to leave you with this quote that we both saw and we both really liked. And it's that history that doesn't make you uncomfortable is propaganda.
Exactly. And that was on a church billboard, by the way. That was on a church
billboard that we saw. And I think we both have experienced, when it comes to civil rights, I think a lot of people our age have been taught propaganda as opposed to history.
Yes.
They have been taught that basically civil rights emerges from the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education and then swan dives into a beautiful crescendo in 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act.
And then after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, racism's cured, y'all.
And it's all over.
It's everything.
It's all over.
It's all good.
Done. It's good.
You know, like it's cured. Black people and white people live in harmony. No one sees color anymore. We all hold hands and we sing Kumbaya. No, that's not what happens.
It's not reality.
It is not.
Civil rights started the second slavery ended and is still going on today. It's still happening all the time today. So if you're watching this and you're kind of like, but things have gotten better, right? You know, there's no Jim Crow laws. There's no white-only primaries. South Carolina has a black senator. That is all true. But something that the Isaac Woodard story fits into a pattern is that regardless of the progress of black people in housing or politics, violence committed by law enforcement, people who are
the same.
Violence by law enforcement against black people has stayed consistent.
And people of color.
And just people in color in general. Law enforcement being used as a club, as a cudgel for white supremacy has stayed the same whether we are talking about the 1940s, 1840s, 1720s, 2020s. It has stayed the same. And I think that's another propaganda that we learn is that, at least you and me, when we were learning civil rights, is that they emphasize nonviolence a lot, right?
Yeah.
They emphasized that Rosa Parks was nonviolence, Martin Luther King was nonviolence. And yes, nonviolent resistance is a fantastic tool to fight discrimination and fascism and all these things that you want to destroy. But you can't, on the one hand, talk about how important nonviolence is, while on the other hand, completely ignoring the horrifying, numerous, unending examples of violence that were committed by white supremacists in order to maintain the status quo. Doing one while not doing the other is propaganda. Did you have anything else to say, beautiful?
Well, all I can say is vote in your local elections. One of the best ways that you can cut down on systemic issues is locally. It's where all of the big court cases start, right? All of the court cases that make it to the Supreme Court and make the change that we see today in America, they start at local courts, local legislation. So in any way, if you want to stop seeing the lesser of two evils every 4 years, the best way to combat that is to do your research, be well read, know who your local senators, your local congresspeople, your mayor, your governor. You need to do research. You need to know who those people are. I know it seems boring, but local shit really is it's where all of those changes that you want to happen stem from. So, go down to your local office of whatever party that you want to work for and see what I'm sure there's so many volunteers that they need, especially in the election season that we're in right now. And yeah, that's all I want to say. Also, one last thing I would like to end with is the future is ahead of us. And with that, we will see you next time.
Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Good
Bye.
night.